Yep, excellent. Okay, welcome back. Well, that was a really interesting first session this morning. Thanks to Isolde and all the presenters and discussants. A lot to think about, and I think I feel like I probably need to look back and rewatch some of the video to take in all of it and to think about what we need to do as a result. But for this next session, we're going to focus or refocus. We're going to move away from cartels and collusion, and we're going to take a look at market definition and look at the way that authorities could use surveys, HHI, simulations, these kind of aspects, and how a gender lens might be relevant within those contexts. And so for the first presentation, I'm going to go to Lola Damstra, Gunnar Niles, and Nicole Rosenbaum from Oxera, who are going to make their presentation. And we'll have a discussant slot from Alessandra Tonazzi, who's the Director of International at the Italian Competition Agency, and Gabriella Kohlmeier, who is Associate General Counsel at Verizon in the US. Lola, would you like to put up your slides?
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, that's great.
Fantastic. I'll hand over to Gunnar.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much. Hi, everyone. We are delighted to take part in this OECD initiative. So thanks very much to Chris and all the others at the OECD for organizing this and inviting us to contribute one of the studies. Our study focuses on the gender data gap in competition analysis, in particular in market definition and mergers. We are very much inspired here by the book Invisible Women. I probably don't need to promote this book for this audience, but I think the author, Caroline Criado Perez, deserves a special mention for this really eye-opening book that she wrote on this topic. Now, competition authorities and we as practitioners virtually always refer to consumers in the aggregate when we look at market definition and mergers. And now this is competition policy, so maybe the consequences of any data gap may not be as dramatic as in the examples of seatbelt safety or spacesuits that really negatively affect women. Because of these data gaps in the analysis, but it may matter in some markets, and we need to test this, and hence our study that we are carrying out. Now, we decided to really take a practical approach. We have a lot of past surveys that we worked on in merger cases and other competition cases. So we decided to actually sort of review all these surveys and see whether there were actually any differences in gender that we didn't look at the time. Now, we looked at surveys that Oxera has done in the past, but also very helpfully, we got a lot of support from a number of competition authorities who also contributed surveys to our study. So we're very grateful for all the authorities that have worked with us. Now, actually, we discovered a bit to our dismay that some of our own surveys, actually, the raw data don't even have a breakdown by gender, so we couldn't use those. That's a lesson in its own right for survey design. Also, of course, not in all markets does one expect a difference by gender, but there may be markets. Again, one needs to test that. Even if there is a difference, this may not always matter for your competition analysis. We refer to the so-called United Brands fallacy, the bananas case. Even if you find that, like the court and the European Commission did in the late 70s, even if you find that babies and elderly people with no teeth can't switch away from bananas, that doesn't mean that bananas are a separate market if sellers of bananas can't really price discriminate between buyers. But there are, of course, markets where sellers do engage in price discrimination and product differentiation. And in those markets, differences by gender may matter. So today we want to share with you a short overview of sort of our approach and methodology, and an initial flavor of the results so far. And ultimately, we hope that our work will contribute to some guidance to how competition authorities can take gender into account when carrying out market definition or merger analysis. And we also actually have high hopes that our work is very much complementary to the work done by analysis group that we will discuss after our presentation.
Yes, so to continue the discussion about the analysis that we're doing, as Gunnar said, a big thank you to all those who have shown great willingness to discuss with us and provide us with information on their consumer surveys. Many thanks, really appreciate it. And as you can see, aside from the Oxera surveys that we did on behalf of our own clients, there were a number of authorities and other institutions that provided us with very helpful insights and information. So thanks a lot for that. And that's also enabling us to have a very nice spread in terms of sectors. As you can see, we have a spread of 7 sectors at this stage, and hope to get some very nice, interesting insights from that sectors and surveys. As a starting point, I wanted to say that we took the existing surveys as a starting point. So the question around is the choice of national competition authorities to enforce on one case and not on another, is that choice in fact biased potentially by gender as well, or not as well, but if it's affected, that's however, interestingly, it's not within the scope of our research. We take the existing cases that have been enforced, that have been assessed by competition authorities, and look at that at those data points, and to see whether there's a gender bias and how to deal with that potentially. So let's look at what we hope to do in our analysis, how we hope to contribute. So the first step is basically filling in the gender data gap. As Gunnar already said, we don't know whether there's a gender bias because we tend to aggregate the results of a survey and only assess the whole sample as a whole, and not specific for male and female respondents. So the first step we will take is to, in fact, rerun the survey and see, is there a difference between the two groups? And that's where our first toolkit comes in, the light blue toolkit, in providing, hopefully, the competition authorities with some how-to answers. To give you one example, if you rerun the survey and you look at female respondents versus male respondents, and you see, in fact, a difference, you should also consider whether there are other demographic characteristics of those groups that might impact the difference you see. For instance, age, income, social status, transportation means, who knows? All those things can be very influential in the substitution that you see between products, the price sensitivity, and the like. So that's one very important consideration to take. And then in the second stage, if we indeed find that there is a difference between male and female respondents, that brings us to our second toolbox, which is the dark blue toolbox, which we hope to fill with some guidance, some considerations in what does that mean for competition policies? What is the implications of there being a difference between the two groups for whether or not a merger should be approved, whether or not the market should be smaller or wider? So this is the two-step approach that we're taking. And the last slide I want to walk through with you is on market assessment. As you might be aware, there are always different dimensions within a market assessment. The first being the product assessment, with the most extreme form of this is that there is a separate product market for products for men and products for women. For instance, male and female deodorant. I'm sure there are some people who use the deodorant from the other group, so to say, but in general, one might be able to say that can be considered as two different products and product markets. In a less extreme version, it might be that male and female respondents perceive substitutes differently or have a different price sensitivity. Gunnar already said the United Brands case, that someone without teeth might have another preference in terms of fruit than someone with very strong teeth. Hence you should consider that as well. In terms of switching, there are two different things to consider here. So that's the difference in what people perceive as substitutes. A really nice example of one of our surveys is that female respondents are less inclined to take a contract with 2 different sports channels, and are less inclined to watch games on 2 different sports channels, while male respondents might be willing to do so and have a perhaps different willingness to pay as well as a result of that. Besides the substitutes that may be different, there might be a different willingness to switching. It might be the case that female respondents are more loyal than male respondents, or the other way around. And obviously, this might also depend on the at hand. Then lastly, the last dimension is segmentation, which is quite an important one, and which also lines up with the possibility of price differentiation. And here, there's a very clear link to the second presentation by Analysis Group, where we was very interesting to hear their thoughts on. If a company or a supplier is in fact able to price differentiate between men and women towards their pricing, the product tweaks to the product, for instance, it might be that if one of those groups is in fact less price sensitive, that the price insensitive group might be protected from excessive behavior, for instance, by the price sensitive group. And this all depends on the sizes of the 2 groups. And as you often see in survey design, and when the sample was there, you see that the researchers often take great care in making sure that the sample is in fact representative of the total population, which is a very good thing, and which probably in some cases will mean that there are 50% of male respondents and 50% of female respondents. However, it might be that the product is not bought in 50-50 shares, but there are only 30% male buyers and 70% female buyers. So in taking into consideration the representativeness of the sample, you should in fact look at the consumer base and not the population as a whole. So these types of considerations we hope to get from the analysis, and hope to feed back to the OECD, and hopefully will help the national competition authorities in dealing with potential implications of gender biases. And the last part of our presentation will be about one of those studies that we are currently looking at, and Lola will tell you all about the survey in the supermarket sector.
So as Nicole said, I'd like to take you through some of the findings that we had in one of the surveys that we looked at. And in this case, this was a survey conducted in the context of a supermarkets merger. And the survey was conducted outside of the supermarket after shoppers had already done their purchases. And then what they were asked was, how much did you spend? And what would you have done if this supermarket would have been closed for the next 3 months? And then they could have answered, well, I wouldn't have made the purchase, or I would have gone to a supermarket of the same brand elsewhere, or I would have gone to an alternative store. And of particular interest is then the customers, the proportion of customers that would have gone to an alternative store that is in fact owned by the other merchant party. And using this information, you can then calculate the diversion ratios, and they calculated how much the merging parties would be able to raise the prices using an illustrative price rise test. And what they found was that 6 out of 9 merging party stores would not have been able to raise their prices following the merger. And so in our analysis, we decided to have a look at these diversion ratios, but separately for male and female respondents. And we found that actually for all supermarkets except one, more male respondents went to a emerging party supermarket. And in some cases, this was 30 percentage points more than female. And we actually tested whether this was driven purely by gender or potentially by some other factors. Like Nicole said, there may be other factors at play that actually drive these differences, such as, for example, the mode of transport, or employment status, age, or even the type of purchase that they came for. And even when controlling for these variables, we found that indeed female shoppers were less likely to go to an emerging party store. And then the question is, what does that mean for competition analysis? What is the result of this finding? Because is it actually possible for those merging parties to then charge higher prices following the merger for male respondents? Thinking about, for example, the bananas case, we may say, well, probably not, because as we found in the survey, there were actually many more female respondents, which may be representative of there being more female shoppers, in which case the female shoppers can protect the male shoppers. Or is it maybe possible that these stores can price discriminate and offer significant discounts to female shoppers, and kind of in that way charge higher prices to the males, or even maybe use product differentiation and have particular products that are for men. Nicole mentioned deodorant, but maybe also there are particular products that men are more inclined to come to the supermarket for. For example, we notice they come more often for a meal deal or for tobacco and alcohol. And so maybe it's those products that they can raise the prices for. And it is in our report that we hope to shed light on these questions and actually provide authorities and practitioners with a toolkit to answer these questions, and to first assess the differences, and then to assess how this can be taken into consideration in competition policy. I'll leave it there, and I'm looking forward to comments from Gabrielle and Alessandra.
Thank you very much, Lola. That was fascinating stuff. Let me turn to Alessandra to begin with.
Thank you very much, Chris. And first of all, let me thank the OECD, first of all, for inviting me to participate in this interesting discussion, but most importantly for taking up this topic first as a topic for discussion within the competition committee week, and now for taking this, for sponsoring research in this field, because I think it's particularly important for competition agencies to see some of the possibly practical implication, not only theoretical implication of this topic. So while attention to the role of women in competition agencies and in private practice has been increasing in the last few years, there is still very limited analysis on the perspective that a gender lens might bring to cases. So what I found really interesting about this research, the presentation we just heard from Oxira, is that it tackles something that is in the everyday life of competition agencies. The preliminary results that we just heard, I think are very interesting because while the fact that different groups of consumers might show different reaction to increases in prices, so different demand elasticity is not something new in the analysis of competition agencies. For example, the implication for market definition is recognized in many guidelines for mergers, for example, the US ones. However, this perspective of looking at the gender difference is something still very new. And One example, one recent example that I would like to mention is a recent case by the FTC suing Procter & Gamble for the acquisition of a rival that had as an entry strategy the elimination of the so-called pink tax. But this is something, at least to my knowledge, that it's still isolated. Overall, competition agencies don't look, when they define markets, at differences, at gender differences. And I found about the presentation by Oxira interesting, not only the fact that they show that in fact, when looking at the surveys, they find significant gender differences, but also the example that we've just seen of the supermarket merger, because in this case, they also show that a different diversion ratio between males and females may lead to significant implication in the assessment of the effects of the merger. Because a competition agency might want to look at how the differences might be exploited to raise prices after the merger, and if you overlook the different effect on the two groups, you might overlook also this ability to increase prices. I know that the results that we are seeing today are still at a very preliminary stage, and I'm looking forward to the completion of the project. And I would like just to make a couple of points on aspects that could be further developed in the analysis. The first one is looking at and comparing differences for males and females to other possible differences in demographics, such as age groups or socioeconomic groups, when possible, of course, when we have this data. And this is, I'm thinking of this as a way to overcome possible objections that might say, okay, yes, this is, we find that this is a relevant difference, the gender difference, but there are many other relevant segmentations and competition authorities can possibly look at all of them. So there should be something specific, and I'm saying this, I'm convinced that this is a difference that is relevant, at least for some differentiated products, but it would still strengthen the analysis if this could be shown. And the second point that I think would make this research very useful from the point of view of enforcers would be to further show the link between the difference that we observe in the preferences for males and females and the robustness and effectiveness of case analysis. So to convince enforcers that they should pay attention to the gender lens, and allow me here to say that one might encounter also some skepticism. We are now discussing this among people that are in a way already sensitive to this kind of, to the importance of this analysis, not always within competition agencies or even in the antitrust community as a whole, you will find the same attention to these issues. So it would be important to show that overlooking a factor such as the gender difference can negatively affect the effectiveness of the analysis. And I think in this respect that what we'll hear next, the presentation by the analysis group, and I don't want to spoil it, but will be a very good example of that. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Alessandra. Gabriella, can you hear us?
Yes. Thank you, Chris. Can everyone hear me? Yes. All right. So I'm Gabrielle Kohlmeyer. I'm Associate General Counsel and Competition Policy Lead at Verizon. I also chair Women Connected for the American Bar Association Antitrust Section. So this idea of inclusive competition lies close to my heart, and it's been really fantastic working with Chris, others, and the leadership that the OECD and others have brought to this area over the past several years. Sarah Long earlier mentioned that lack of data was one of the biggest problems around the making progress in terms of gender inclusivity in competition. And I think that while I agree, I think taking this idea of gender inclusive competition seriously as an issue was equally challenging. And the participation by all of these enforcers, researchers, thought leaders, I think today is tremendous in and of itself and marks clear progress and is a huge accolade to the organizers. In terms of this specific project, I really applaud Lola, Gunnar, and Nicole for their research and for this excellent overview that they just provided. I've been like a kid in a candy store learning about their approach, the preliminary applications, possibilities that lie ahead. So just a few comments and questions for me revolve primarily around kind of survey design, feasibility of applying this as a gender lens, and the broader application possibilities. So first, I was really impressed by the breadth and variety of the sources in this in terms of the enforcers that contributed and the internal client consumer surveys that were available, and also the variety of industries that were represented. That seems very important to the broader application and the weight that we can draw from the findings. I think it will be really interesting to learn more about what comparisons you find as you're digging into these different sources and industries. You know, differences in terms of switching and revealed preferences, segmentation by different industries. Does it vary by product market? And how granular do the questions need to be to kind of get at those differences? I was also really curious how hard it was to get the surveys and to get relevant data. And I think it would be really helpful as research continues and builds on this work that you're doing for enforcers to understand that whether there were legal challenges to overcome in terms of privacy, permissions, and so forth. And to make the point made in one of the sessions this morning about the importance of data, was the data that you needed available in the surveys that you examined? Could it be disaggregated? You already mentioned that some of the surveys didn't have gender broken out in usable ways. How much of an impediment was that? It seems that making recommendations around that may be something that can really be beneficial to enforcers and policymakers as they are using survey design. And similarly, since this is about inclusivity, any kind of discussions that you had around whether the surveys themselves were designed inclusively, given that you were dealing with surveys that had already been conducted, but in assessing, you know, how much weight to place in them in terms of survey structure, diversity of the people designing the questions, diversity of the people asking and being asked. All of those things seem like they would be interesting for further examination, and particularly as you are making tangible recommendations for enforcers and others using the surveys. And then I think, you know, one of the questions that I think many bring to this is around the burden. You know, this is is it just a nice to have, but it's so burdensome that it doesn't really warrant the additional work that is required. And so I think it'd be really interesting to understand particularly if you start with, you know, a certain approach towards survey design that you might lay out, how much additional work and cost does this actually require? Is it something that is feasible for enforcers and others that are using the tool that you're laying out? And then finally, there were, you know, discussions this morning about how excited we are generally about the broader possibilities that a lot of this research brings. And I'm really eager on the perspective of opportunities to apply this beyond gender, including intersectional categories, non-binary gender definitions, and even for markets where targeting is occurring at very granular levels far beyond gender. So as you can see, I think even the preliminary setup is extremely interesting, and I highly commend you for contributing to this important developing area.
Great, thanks, Gabrielle. Lola and team, would you care to respond to either any of the points made there?
Yeah, I'll start. In particular, a few points that I picked up from both Gabrielle and Alessandra about the importance of understanding where these differences are coming from, and choosing to look at gender over potentially other important subjects. And I think Alessandra's point that maybe there are other segmentations that are important. I think it is very good to use econometrics to ensure what these differences are coming from, and we're trying to do so by controlling for other variables, maybe differences in social status, as well as a number of other factors, to understand what is driving these differences, and is this actually due to gender, or are there other issues at play that maybe are more important to look at and are driving these differences. So I think we are very much looking at this and trying to disaggregate this. And I think that ties into Gabrielle's question about survey design, because it is true that the more questions that are being asked and the more information that you have about these respondents allows us to understand what is driving these differences. So, for example, if we did not know what the shoppers were coming for in terms of product purchase, we may have thought that these differences were purely driven by being male or female, whereas in reality we noticed that some of it was actually driven by the type of purchase that they came for. And so I think ideally we learn along the way which of these questions help us disentangle this, and we will be able to at the end give an overview as well of what type of questions will need to be included in the survey to disentangle these effects. So besides asking about the very obvious gender, there may need to be other questions included in the survey to understand what is driving these differences.
Yes, and maybe to pick up on the other points that Gabriella made in terms of how difficult it was to actually get the help from the NCAs and the surveys. Surprisingly, not that difficult, in the sense that were very helpful and enthusiastic to help us on this. We did have a number of discussions about confidentiality, for instance, obviously perfectly understandable. And a hurdle that some of the NCAs ran into was that they did not do the surveys themselves, but they had a third party performing the survey, and hence there were property rights and IP rights and all that. So maybe it would be good to consider that an NCA asking a third party to do a survey to ensure that you at least get the raw data to be able to do the analysis yourself and break it down in different, be it male versus female or age or any other vulnerable group, for instance. So that's number one. And then again, as Lola already said, the design of the survey is very crucial. The most crucial part is asking the gender, obviously, and while that is such an open door, one very funny example, to be honest, is one of the cases that Adele worked on. It was a transport case where the survey was on in person, and the person asking the questions to the people that used the bus, for instance, did not involve what's their gender, because they were looking them in the face and could see that it's a man or a woman in front of them, and just didn't write it down. So we had no idea whether there were in fact male or female respondents, and we're not able to use that survey, unfortunately. Having said that, I think we were really positively surprised with all the help we got, and next time we'll make sure that we ask the gender in any survey we'll do.
And maybe, Chris, if I can just two quick observations on Gabrielle's final question, which is also a really good one about the burden. Just two observations. I think, first of all, if you are going forward, designing a survey for any competition analysis, it's not a great burden at all to just also focus on gender-specific questions, just like you focus on any other potential differences between customer types. So from that perspective, I would have thought it isn't as great a burden as us trying to go back to previous surveys where the focus wasn't that. But my second observation would be, even if it is a burden, so what? I mean, authorities need to do their job, and if this is a serious matter for competition policy, then authorities should analyze it, just like they analyze other potential competition concerns. So it isn't a nice to have. This should really be sort of on the standard checklist or toolkit of authorities to look at. And in some cases, as we said, it may not matter, and then you quickly move on. But in other cases, it may matter, and you do need to pick it up.
Thank you, guys. I've got a quick question from Mary Catherine on the chat. Are the surveys all dealing with mergers, or do we have, I don't know, market studies and others mixed up in there?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. We have a variety of surveys actually. Some are more general market investigations, understanding how markets are working. For example, we have surveys on asking if consumers have switched their mobile providers in the past, if they're planning to, if they're doing any search on that. So there's a variety of questions that can be asked that is relevant for our research. And we try to group those together so that we get a good overview of, for example, switching behavior, where we have a set of surveys that can inform that, as well as, for example, more merger-related questions. So it's not purely merger surveys, and we are still actually open to receiving more surveys.
That's good to know, just to make sure everybody still contacts if they've got something to share. Just a quick question from me. I find this supermarkets example really interesting. Am I right in thinking, so if you've got in pretty much all of the cases, you've got some significant difference between men and women's diversion ratios, and then you've got in 6 of the cases, was it 6 in the cases there was a problem, or there wasn't? I forget. In any case, 6 and 3 in either direction. So does that suggest then that you've got a couple of cases there where you've got a potential harm to some subsection of the consumer body? I mean, I just say this as you say, a key point is around, can you price discriminate across them? But I suppose I'm just conscious of previous work where in UK supermarkets, where we've often sort of said it's not so much about pricing as much as range provided and these kind of aspects. No, so this kind of non-price competition is quite important in those cases. So that seems quite a significant finding. Am I misinterpreting or getting over enthusiastic?
No, Chris, I think you're absolutely right. I think this could have very big implications. Unfortunately, we didn't have access to the price cost margins because we purely focused on the survey data. So we couldn't rerun the test and see how much they would be able to raise prices purely for the male respondents. But given the big difference that we found between the male and female respondents, it could very well be that you go from a threshold of 4-5% in rising prices to suddenly 12% for men, and then you're actually suddenly in a range where this is worrying. So yeah, I think that's very well possible.
Yeah, and Chris, this is also an example of where we also for our study need to be, of course, a bit careful, and this goes to confidentiality in past surveys. So we don't want to go as far as sort of second guessing, like should the authority have done something different. And we will also present our results very anonymously. So we won't even say which country this was in. And the other interesting bit of this example was actually that this was an instance where male customers would be negatively affected.
Indeed. Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And the other thing that struck me thinking about that was, particularly as we look at sort of increased, digital markets being everywhere, and most of that which we discuss, I mean, the possibilities of price discriminating in digital markets must be significantly easier on a gender basis, I would suspect. And so, yeah, anyway, we'll leave that hanging. Okay, if there aren't any other questions, let's maybe I can move to Marissa and Johanna to make the presentation from analysis group.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody, by the way.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect.
Well, first I'll start off by thanking the OECD for the great opportunity for us to speak at this super interesting workshop and to contribute to this interesting topic. My name is Marissa Ginn. My colleague and co-presenter is Johanna Posch. We're economists at the Analysis Group. We're based in Montreal and London. And our presentation today is going to focus on product markets and specifically how changes to the product market definition that takes into account gender can have important implications when evaluating potential competitive effects of mergers, for example. So specifically what we show is that for a product with a pink tax, so there's a price differential between men and women's products, for which we scraped some pricing data off the internet, we find that the gender price differential would be further exacerbated when evaluating a hypothetical merger. So to the extent that competition authorities are aiming to reduce inequalities across gender in the form of pink taxes or through price discrimination or otherwise through their merger evaluation or enforcement activities, we hope that our contribution and our analysis can help illustrate how a gender lens can have an impact. And also we hope that it stimulates a discussion as to how and when and why a gender lens can and should be considered. So before we dive into the content, a couple of disclaimers. A number of our colleagues at the Analysis Group have been assisting us on this project with us. And second, all of our results are preliminary. For this presentation, we focused on the potential competitive effects of a merger, but we're also planning on looking more into the market definition aspect per se, as well as providing ideas on how to address potential data issues that might arise in attempting to incorporate gender, which we've talked about already quite a bit today, and is complementary to Oksara's presentation just now as well, in addition to a number of other aspects, which we're going to discuss later on in the presentation. So in terms of an agenda for our presentation, we're just going to walk through the motivating questions for the project. And then next, we're going to talk about what we've chosen as an illustrative market for our analysis, which is the wet shaver razor market. Then we'll talk to you about our analytical approach and we'll present our preliminary findings. And then we'll talk to you about our next steps and some topics for discussion.
So the motivating question that we sort of started our thought process from was, when evaluating merger or conducting an antitrust investigation, how should competition agencies and how should we as economists account for the potential effect of gender in assessing the relevant product market or possible anti-competitive effects? And we think this matters because previous research has identified a pink tax in a number of gender-targeted product markets where women are charged more than men for largely homogeneous products. And we think that not considering this potential role of gender in product market definitions and analysis of potential competitive effects may conceal possible disproportionate effects on a particular group of consumers. And so the way we've approached this so far was also a bit on a case study basis of a case study product that we chose. And for this particular product, which was the razor market, we scraped data of the web, and we scraped price data, product descriptions, and number of reviews. And we also used, for a number of our analyses, some estimates of parameters from the literature. And what kind of our idea was to perform a couple of common analyses and apply common tools that we would use in merger reviews and antitrust investigations that are used to assess potential competitive effects, and then evaluate how our analytical findings or our conclusions in a particular case might change with or without consideration of gender. And of course, again, this is another disclaimer. This is, of course, just for illustrative purposes. We take a case study market, but this is not meant to capture accurately all the relevant competitive aspects of this market. So this is kind of what we've done so far, and where we're moving now is to consider challenges in performing such analyses, you know, in terms of data limitations, and then try to suggest concrete steps for data collection and analytical approaches that may help us overcome these.
All right, so I'll walk a little bit of this. The illustrative product that we chose is the wet shave razor market, which is disposable razors or system razors. Disposable razors are the ones with the blades attached to the handle. System razors are ones where you can swap off the cartridge. And these have been found to be a market in other contexts. So the reasons why we chose this specific product, we were trying to think of some different products that we could look at. We were looking for something that was relatively homogeneous but highly gendered, so that it was really marketed specifically to one gender or another, but that it could be used interchangeably between genders. We were also looking for products in a market that was relatively concentrated, because our thinking behind that would be that we would be more easily able to show potential impacts. Some additional interesting features of this market is that there are a number of new entrants, of direct-to-consumer entrants. So these are selling, you know, directly through social media or through the web, their products, and they've sort of disrupted the market. One interesting feature is that some of these direct-to-consumer entrants are actually marketing on the basis of the pink tax itself, as trying to undercut the pink tax, essentially. And so we thought that the combination of these things together created some potentially interesting dynamics to explore for our case study. Here we just put together a slide where we showed a couple of the products, just to give you a sense of exactly what we're looking at. So these are two sets of disposable razors, both with 4 razors in a pack, both with 3 blades on a razor, both with the little strip of moisturizer, whatever it is on it. And as you can see here, that there's a clear difference between the men's and women's product. The women's product being differentiated through its, you know, curvy pink handle. But as you see, like the unit price itself is far higher it's basically $1.50 each for the women's product and $1.07 each for the men's product. So there's a substantial pink tax being charged here.
Yeah, okay, and just a quick overview of what our analytical approach has been so far. So as I've already said, we used web scrape data to kind of inform our analysis. Of course, not all the data, all the prices that you can find on the web are necessarily representative of the prices you will find consumers will face in general when buying these products. But some literature has actually found that online prices are roughly representative of offline prices. And so we use that as a proxy. And in this analysis, we've collected prices, product descriptions, and number of reviews of Amazon and Walgreens in the US. We've then applied regular expressions to the product descriptions to identify product characteristics. such as gender, but also how many blades and all this kind of stuff. And what we also do is we use the review share online as a proxy for the market share in this analysis. And so this is the first sort of to give you a picture of the market we've constructed with these data. These are the market shares of the manufacturers. These names are obviously not real names, so we've decided to replace them with fictional, nice sounding ones. And I guess kind of two things that you can take away from this slide, which is that first, the market is very concentrated, and probably any merger in this market would raise would really raise concerns. But the second is, and that's actually quite interesting, is that a few of the manufacturers, and this is just the real data as we got it, a few of the manufacturers do have a stronger presence in one or the other of the gendered markets. So like the gorgeous groomers will have a stronger presence in the female market, whereas the reasonable razors has a stronger presence in the male market. So so this is already something interesting to observe. And then here, these are the per unit prices, the average per unit prices per manufacturer, weighted by the number of reviews. So we'll have more frequently purchased ones with a higher weight. And here, I would say one thing to really take away is that, you know, of our 5 manufacturers that we've considered do charge a significant a pink tax. So I guess the two sort of takeaways from this is this market, there are some manufacturers who focus on one gender, and there are manufacturers who charge pink taxes. And so this kind of already gives us a sense that it might make sense to apply a gender lens to this market.
All right, so I'll walk through our sort of toy study, which is this hypothetical merger of the second and third largest manufacturers. The second largest manufacturer is one that roughly sold equal amounts to men and women based on, you know, using our proxy of reviews as volume. The third one is one in which there's a larger proportion being sold to women than to men. So we thought that would potentially create some interesting dynamics to look at. And so here on the first slide, we're plotting just the simple HHI. So we've done this a couple ways. We've looked at simple, you know, a naive or a basic HHI evaluation, and then we'll talk to you a bit later about how we looked at also a merger simulation. So this slide is presenting the results of just looking at HHI. So it's the sum of squared of the market shares. And what we see here is that, as Johanna mentioned earlier, this market is highly concentrated. So any merger here would raise red flags for an authority. But I think the main point to show here is that we really do see sizable differences in the changes in HHIs between women and men's markets. So on the next slide, we do a similar sort of study, but we look at a merger simulation. And just to give you the context for the merger simulation, we're using the PC AIDS model developed by Epstein and Rubenfeld in 2001. And we're using some estimates from the literature on own price elasticities and market elasticities for these types of products of -2 and -1. And so when we plug in our prices and these assumptions into the model, we end up getting these differential impacts on prices. So what we show on the left-hand side are the pre-merger average prices. Again, these are the prices that are weighted by what our proxy for volume is, which is the reviews. And then on the right-hand side are the post-merger average prices. And so the green dots are the ones that's essentially the combined market for men and women. The pink triangles are the women's market, and the blue are for men's products. And so what we see here is that this merger overall would cause an 8.8% increase in prices. So it's a large increase in prices. But what's really interesting is that the increase in prices for women would be substantially higher than the increase in prices for men, at 11% for women versus 6.7% for men. And the consequence of that differential price impact on women and men would be that it would further exacerbate the pink tax that was already pre-existing in this market. So the pink tax would go up from 70 cents to 86 cents, so roughly 24%. So we think that the main conclusions from this first preliminary set of our data analysis are, either using a more basic HHI evaluation or something a bit more complex like a merger simulation. And we're planning on doing some additional analyses as well. But under any of these contexts, these would obviously raise red flags for merger simulation. But I think the main contribution here is showing how incorporating a gender lens can really have a substantial impact on what you obtain as results. We see that in the much larger change in HHIs. We see that as well in the much larger change in prices. So to the extent that people are concerned with a pink tax and the ability to price differentiate and the potential impact that has on women, we think that this is important to consider.
Right. And so maybe as an outlook, so what we've obviously focused on so far is really a market where the case is really clear in the sense that it's very concentrated, it's very clearly marketed towards the products are specifically marketed towards a particular gender, and it's almost something where it would be a bit obvious to think of including a gender lens in the analysis. But of course, this raises the question, well, okay, does this mean these types of considerations should play a role in any merger review, in any antitrust investigation? And if we think not, then, well, what contexts, what are potential signs that should, make us careful about gender considerations, and what should we be looking at? For example, should we be looking at the pink tax specifically? Should we be looking at who are the consumers? And this kind of links back to the previous presentation. Who are the majority of the consumers? Are there differences in the elasticities of demand? And another thing that we were also thinking about is, are there maybe other product characteristics that may be related to gender that are maybe less obvious in the data, but that we should be looking at, something like color, for example. And so that's why sort of one of our major next steps is kind of to think about these issues, think about what additional data do we need to be looking for and do we need to collect in order to be able to assess whether a gender lens is necessary on a particular case. And for instance, do we need transactional level data that has the identity of the purchaser and has the gender of the purchaser? What should competition authorities be requesting when looking at these cases? Another sort of more broader question that we discussed a little bit was, we currently have kind of rough thresholds of particular metrics that we look at when evaluating a transaction, for example, that will start to raise red flags. Well, in terms of differential effects across genders, are there any additional metrics that we maybe should be looking at to take these differential effects specifically into account when looking at such a case? So this is just an open question. And another thing that we wanted to mention, but that is kind of clearly out of the scope of this particular project probably, is that there's been an increased interest in looking at input markets, specifically labor markets. And of course, the equivalent of our pink tax in labor markets is the gender wage gap. And so there might be a very interesting angle of looking at the same issue from that perspective.
So thank you very much for oh, sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry, I thought you'd finished.
No, we're done. We're done. We just wanted to thank everybody for listening, and we're hoping that that we could have an interesting discussion on these points that we've been thinking quite a bit about.
Good. Thank you very much. That was really, really, really interesting. Really got a lot from that. For discussants for this section, we're lucky to have Javier Garcia Verdugo, who's the Chief Economic Advisor of the Spanish Competition Authority, and Amanda Athaide, who is the co-founder of Women in Antitrust in Brazil. Maybe we can start with Javier, with your comments.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. Well, thank you very much. I would like to thank the OECD and particularly Chris for inviting me to act as discussant for this research project. And I would also like to thank Marisa and Johanna for their work and their presentation, which was enlightening and thought-provoking. Well, it goes without saying that we will be happy to offer any help that Marisa and Johanna need to finish their research agenda or to put it into practice. Due to the short time available, I will content myself with just a question and a couple of general comments. The question, I think that the project presented is quite clear and illustrative of the need for the introduction of a gender perspective in market definition. I think it's very useful. I will use it in inside training within the authority to raise awareness. I think it's very, very useful for us. I have enjoyed reviewing it and considering the implications that can be derived from it. My question is as follows. It seems quite reasonable to use PCA's model for the merger simulation, considering the limited data available. As you said, PCA requires three inputs, market shares, own price elasticity, and market elasticity. And you have said the own price and market elasticity is equal for the male and female markets. Therefore, different increases in prices would be due to different market shares of the products in the female and male markets. So my question is it reasonable to assume that the elasticities are the same in the female and male segments of the market in light of the data and the possible existence, the existence that you showed of a pink tax? Or to put it differently, could we infer from the data that there is a higher or lower elasticity for female and male segments? That's the question. So for the comments, the first comment, more broad, more general, is it seems to me that a market definition that ignores gender perspectives would be incomplete at best and could be incorrect at worst. So we are all well aware that market definition is the cornerstone of competition investigations, and so the choice of products and geographic areas will determine the outcome of the competitive assessment. So by taking into account gender perspectives, practitioners would only be doing their due diligence, it seems. Although in many cases there may be no relevant differences between segments, ignoring or downplaying gender differences in some markets increases the probability of type 1 and type 2 errors. The second comment on future topics of research or areas of application more specifically, sometimes the need to introduce gender perspectives in market definition can be quite obvious. As pointed out by Santa Creu, Basud, and Pike in their 2018 paper, this is what happens, for example, in cases such as Sara Lee and Unilever, when products are gendered, meaning that they are retail or marketed to male and female audiences differently. So ignoring these differences can lead to a market definition that is either too narrow or too wide. So in the worst case scenario, one could imagine that failing to account for gender differences in product marketing could lead to a sort of pink cellophane fallacy, whereby evaluating a market at one gender segment's current price could lead to an incorrect market definition. However, there are a variety of products where the need for introducing a gender perspective is not so clear, can be subtler. One example, for example, is car insurance, where gender differences are accounted for by the insurance firm internally when determining the risk factors for the consumer purchasing the insurance, but are not explicitly stated in the final quote, at least frequently. In this case, male and female consumers face different prices, and it would be key to identify whether these can be attributed to varying competitive conditions, such as differing markets or differences in the production of the good. Additionally, another example, when market definition is dependent on consumers' behavior, we would need to be aware of gender-specific traits shown in past research. For example, there's a large body, as you know, a large body of literature about financial markets that identify differences between male and female preferences for example, methods of payments, risk profiles when selecting portfolios, or willingness to acquire debt. And to my third comment on the practical implementation of a gender perspective and perhaps answering some of the suggestions presented. I think that testing for gender perspective, now that we are more aware of this issue, should be included in the practitioner's checklist, as was said before, when determining product and geographic markets. Properly controlling for these gender differences does not imply a methodological revolution and would only require a slight adjustment in current best practices, I think. So competition practitioners need not be too innovative or inventive when studying how to adapt their methods. There is a vast literature regarding team management, for example, or qualitative data gathering and quantitative data analysis that have already explored in other fields many of the issues relating to gender perspective. So perhaps my last comment would be that competition authorities should absorb these best practices already tried in other fields and where possible, build on them. Thank you very much. That would be all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Javier. That was really all very useful points as well. I'll give you a chance to respond in a sec, but shall we go to Amanda for her discussant role first?
Thank you. First, I would like to thank the OECD for the opportunity to join this event as a discussion. And I would like to thank Chris Pike on behalf of the OECD team. Well, I am Amanda Ataiji. I am the former head of the leniency unit in CAGE, Brazil, and currently head of the Trade Remedies Department in the Ministry of Economy. And as a professor in the University of Brasilia and as a co-founder of the network called Women in Antitrust, or WIA in Brazil, I'm really honored and thrilled to be here with you today. I really can't pretend that I'm used to a day like today, and it may be because I'm enthusiastic of this topic and obviously biased, but I do consider we're living a milestone day for the competition community. So congratulations, really congratulations to the OECD team for joining all of us today. So our network, Women in Antitrust, or WIA Brazil, was founded in 2019, and since then we have been really striving to reshape the discussions of gender and competition in Brazil. So over those 2 or 3 years, we organized several events with all women panelists. We published 3 books that were written only by women authors, free and available online. We conducted a study of representativeness of women in leadership positions in law firms, economic consultancies, and public sectors. We recently launched a podcast and a mentoring initiative, and we are really having many other projects. We have, I think, more than 2,000 followers on LinkedIn, where like 250 women daily discussion those topics on WhatsApp. So what I would like to say is that besides all of those efforts we're doing, the present discussion of gender and competition on its substantive perspective, however, is highly incipient in Brazil. We haven't yet seen any case or any discussion consider the gender lens in our country, unfortunately. Some of the discussions that were mentioned in the previous panels as to identify, for example, the respondents of a cartel investigation as women or men, or to have a gender perspective in market definition cases, they are definitely still out of the radar of our competition authorities. So the present event is extremely important, not only in my personal perspective, but also in the Brazilian perspective. So considering all this introduction, this brief introduction, I would like to congratulate Marissa and Johanna and their team and the analysis group for the tremendous work in this project. And I would like to make 2 questions, if the presenters may detail their thoughts, so as we can proceed even further in the discussions. So the first question would be, how would you identify a situation where the gender lenses really necessary for the market definition in a merger case, for example. So if we have a disposable horizontal market, or in babies or kids products, for example, it may be a clear approach to take, but are there any screening criteria as to identify a traditional case and a gender lens case in the merger analysis? Would it be price stability, heterogeneous characteristic of the product? Which would be your first thoughts, at least, of those red flags for the market analysis? And the second question would be how these lenses would apply for those recent discussions on labor and antitrust, labor markets and antitrust. So we have seen papers and cases related to no poach agreement, price fixing cartels, etc. And I wonder if there are any discussions on the labor market perspective to be defined, for example, a labor market defined by women or men approach, wage difference approach, which would then influence the market definition analysis. So those are the two questions, and I thank you once again for the opportunity.
Thanks, Amanda. Go ahead, guys.
Sure. So thank you very much for the interesting thoughts and questions. They're all particularly relevant, and since there are points that we have been discussing ourselves internally as well. On the point on demand elasticities, it's definitely something that we think is relevant to consider. I agree that the assumption that you would have equal demand elasticities from men and women is sort of contradicted by the underlying fact that there's a pink tax here. So one of the plans of what we wanted to do for the next steps would actually be to test the impact of using different demand elasticities and see how changing the assumptions around demand elasticities would actually potentially affect our conclusions, and what the interplay between demand elasticity and the price impact might be. Related to the questions as well as on how to identify markets, or which markets, I guess, to focus on. So I think our thoughts so far have been, there seem to be some obvious contenders where products are clearly gendered, where there seems to be some kind of product differentiation going on and price discrimination. But I think another type of market that we could think of, and this also applies to the question surrounding labor markets, are markets that are specifically critical to women. So when you think about, for example, childcare services, or things where we know that dynamics in those markets can have an important impact on reducing income inequality and gender inequality, we would think that those would also be markets that competition authorities should specifically focus on in their merger evaluations and also in their enforcement activities more generally. Johanna, I don't know if you have any other comments.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I just also think that this question of where should we be looking is really one of the major points that, well, we've already mentioned it in the presentation, and I think it's a major thing to think about because, as Javier said, like there are things like you mentioned car insurance, but there's other places. For example, there's a significant pink tax in dry cleaning, and you probably wouldn't think that blouses and shirts are have different prices for dry cleaning. So these kind of things, and we need to think a bit more about are there kind of obvious criteria that we could come up with, or is it simply a matter of coming up with an industry dictionary that kind of has the extent of a gender kind of score on it or something like that. So I think, yeah, that's something that is definitely really worth exploring.
Yeah, and I mean, it strikes me with some of those, like you say, you just wouldn't expect those to necessarily jump out. And so I suppose I wonder, there must be a fairly large grey zone where if it's easy to do, as Oxira was saying earlier, why not just ask the question, and maybe it ends nowhere, who knows, but you haven't really lost that much, I guess, potentially. then you have to take a decision whether to, you know, how far to follow these things down. But yeah, no, really, really interesting stuff. Thank you very much, everybody. Since we're on time, so I'll now, if there are any other questions, please shout now. Totally agree, the childcare. Sarah says, definitely agree that the childcare market is an area for focus. Yes, I second that. And I think somebody else mentioned toys as another example of a market where you might well find this. I think that does feature in some of the pink tax research, so that's not a bad place to start on this. Oh, sorry, there is a quick question came in. Are there ways that we can pursue an activist policy in terms of merger enforcement, or what are we at the behest of what mergers are notified? I guess that's more of a notifications type question, but I mean, we were talking yesterday about changes that are going on in merger notification. I suppose I did hear Pierre Regibaud make the suggestion, the chief economist at DG Comp, who was saying, should we be looking out for killer acquisitions that relate to environmentally sustainable mavericks? And so perhaps there's some equivalent in a gender space. Any thoughts? Don't worry, I'll leave that there.
I think probably Javier is probably the best position.
Yeah, I was just going to add that precisely this new proposal of the Digital Markets Act in Europe reflects this kind of more activist approach to mergers in the digital area. So probably you were talking before about the area of environment policy. So I think that we're pushing in some areas towards a more activist policy in merger control.